I'm about to show you a picture that only a few people in my family have seen. And you're probably already thinking, what kind of picture could this possibly be? So this picture has never been seen in public before. So here's the picture that nobody's ever seen before. You might have already had some idea, maybe you had some conception of what this picture could have been. If, I don't know what you were thinking, I'm sorry if you're disappointed, but this is a picture that hasn't been seen outside of a family album. This is a picture of me, my sister, and a friend of mine. I used to live in Nigeria. This is our house in Nigeria. And I was probably about 7 to 8 years old. And I don't know which one you think it is. Maybe it is the one that you're thinking it is. I'm the one in red, so it matches the red circle. I know, it's a funny picture. Somebody did say to me when they saw this picture, "You look like a Nigerian." But I think the thing about this picture that's more important is actually what my sister, that's my sister, is pointing at. That television screen. Because I'm very old, a lot of you are very young. I grew up in the 80s. And the television, this big box, this heavy box that's in this showcase. And by the way, when we came back to Pakistan, we kept that showcase. Obviously, we got rid of the television. We upgraded, luckily. Halat behtar ho gaye the. But that television was our main source of entertainment. There was a certain time period when we used to watch cartoons. There was a certain time when there used to be shows for adults. And I have to admit that when my parents were away and that certain time was on, we'd watch those shows as well. The other way, obviously, that we consumed information was through books. I was a book reader. I don't have a picture of that, unfortunately, just this really weird picture of me looking like a Nigerian in a red dress. But I used to read a lot of books. My father loved magazines and newspapers. I didn't read newspapers, but we'd get the Reader's Digest, we'd get Time magazine, Newsweek. And that was how we built a conception of the world beyond the four doors of our house, through controlled mediums, which is television, this big box that you see here, newspapers and magazines, written word, print, and text. Now, I didn't know that about 25 years later, this would be me, and there, that I would actually be in that television. And that I would finally, from being a consumer of information that was coming through television, through newspapers, through books, through magazines, I would actually be producing that information and giving it to people through that one box. I'm going to move on to the sort of next series of pictures. And this is, I think, really interesting. My journey as a journalist reflects your journey as well. And I'll tell you how. Maybe not the younger ones, obviously. But I started off as a print journalist. I used to work for a magazine that's been shut down because nobody read it and nobody wanted it anymore. It was called the Herald magazine. It was long-form investigation. People don't read. And then I moved to multimedia. And multimedia means that I was a reporter for the BBC, and I used to report for print, for online, for radio, for television, and also, obviously, increasingly, the digital space. I moved to TV. I showed you some of those photographs. And now, what I'm looking at is the digital space. And there's been multiple studies that tell you that most people now consume information not through the old-fashioned way of that big box of television or the television screen that I used to be in, but through their phones, through social media, etc. Before I move on to journalist bias and all of that, I want to sort of break down what journalists actually do. Because I'll be honest, when I studied journalism, nobody told me this. We were told this is how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to write a subheading. You're supposed to write a piece. There's an inverted pyramid. There are 4 W's and an H, and that is it. And then they send you off into the world, and you're just supposed to become a journalist magically, which you don't. You learn. But here is what I've discovered through what we actually do, and why this process that I'm showing you is actually breaking down. So the first thing is, imagine there's a sea of information that's all around us. The first thing that a journalist does is corroborate. They have to find out if that information is really true. They have to verify. Once they've verified, once they've checked whether something actually happened, then they curate. And what does that mean? It means that then they filter out some of the white noise, something that's not important, and then they put that out for all of you to see. So first they corroborate, then they curate, and then what happens is that they form critical opinions, and they shape critical opinions. They tell you what's important and why it's important. And these are the three sort of stages. And you'll notice that it is in the shape of a triangle for a particular reason. The sharp end is the most important end. But you reach that sharp end by going through these stages. Like I said, I didn't learn that. We learned that on the job because old-fashioned went through print, now to digital. I don't know if any of you recognizes this. Yeah. I mean, like I said, nerd, reader, love books. One of my favorite books, which book is it? Can anybody? Yes, exactly. And that, to me, I feel I can relate so much to the White Rabbit. The White Rabbit, because you first see the White Rabbit right at the top of the book. And you can see, actually, at the beginning of the book, sorry. And you can see holding a stopwatch, always late, always late, always late. And that is what happens when you're a journalist as well. You feel a little like that White Rabbit. Why? Because you're supposed to make very quick decisions. You're supposed to make decisions about the corroboration that you find, how when you're sort of verifying whether something is true or not, you have to believe people when they tell you, give you information. You have to cross-check it with other people who are telling you something else. Then you have to decide very quickly what is important. That's a curation process. And then you have to tell people why it's important. And that is, like I said, the sharp point at the top of the pyramid or the triangle. So you're constantly in, I would say, Alice in Wonderland. There's magical things happening. And you're always late, and you're supposed to tie the whole story together. One of the issues is, so as a journalist, as I said right at the beginning, they don't teach you these things in journalism school. You have to learn. And you learn these skills along the way. And you also have to contend with something that everybody has to contend with. And that is pretty much the subject. But I can tell you that there are, obviously, it's not just individual biases that are at work at newsrooms, because I've worked at newsrooms. It's individual biases that we have to contend with, our own personal opinions about things and our understanding of the world. We have to contend with the biases of the people that we work with. We have to deal with the biases of the ownership of the channels and the biases of the people in power. So there are multiple biases that go into the product or the content that you see on your television screens or on your mobile phones. And often, I think we simplify this far too much. कि किसकी गलती है? Yes, it's a combination of factors. It is individual biases, it's in-group biases, and I'll talk about that as well. It's also money and it's power. So all of these factors come into play into the kind of bias that you see in different channels. And just as we sort of go into, I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into biases because I think it's really important. These two pictures that you see side by side, they are a reflection of a kind of bias. And we'll talk about that bias. This was posted on social media. This is a Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf leader who was jailed. And this is a picture of her when she was revealed. Now, the picture that you see on my left, yes, this one, is a picture that was posted on social media. A lot of people don't like her. A lot of people had a political agenda. They actually spun a particular story about her based on the fact that there was a hand on her shoulder. But this was the reality. This was her father. She'd been released. She was really happy. People identify these two men as potentially the people with these hands. So what they're tapping into, these fear-mongers on social media, they're tapping into your dislike, your fear, your stereotypes, your gender bias, perhaps, because, it's a woman. And the reason they can do that is because we all have biases. Journalists also have biases, as I pointed out as well, very broadly. I've just identified 3 groups of bias that I'm going to talk about, but there's more. Cognitive bias, that's an important one. Cognitive bias is when you choose to believe, you choose to see what you believe, what you want. Essentially, for instance, if you don't like Sanam Javed, jiski tasveer maine abhi aapko dikhai thi, and you want to believe something bad about her, you'll believe that picture that's been taken out of context. So that taps into your cognitive bias. There's also in-group bias. And in-group bias is when you prefer people who are within your circle. So as a journalist, I would prefer journalists as an example. But a lot of people don't like journalists. Lifafa kehte hain, vagera, vagera, So that is an example of how biases come into play as well. So out-group bias is when you don't like people outside of your group, and you will believe anything, stereotypes that you believe in. These are ethnic, based on ethnic reasons, like, dislike. There's two other really key kinds of bias that are really important for us to recognize in ourselves. One is called availability bias, and that is you tend to remember or recall information that is the most striking to you. So it could be in the form of a great graph or a picture like Sanam Javed's. That is something you'll remember, but you won't remember other pieces of information because they're not as striking or interesting, or they're not coming from a person that you like. There's another bias, it's called the Dunning-Kruger bias, and that's a really interesting one. That is, if you have really basic knowledge about something, for instance, if you don't know very much about vaccines and how they work, Dr. Zafar Mirza is here, you will understand the kind of bias and COVID-19 sort of conspiracy theories that were put out. If you don't understand the science behind it, and it's really simple to you, then you won't see the issue as complex as it is, and you won't understand the problem. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect, as it's called, bias. And the reason all of these biases are important because we are both, for instance, in my case, a producer of information, so I need to be conscious of these biases, or for all of you who are consumers of information. And it's become actually much more critically important. And I know I'm supposed to talk about media house biases, and you were probably expecting me to give you, lots of inside stories and juicy gossip about what happens in media houses. But I think the problem is much broader, and the problem actually comes because of digital media, which is why we need to be aware of these biases. But this white dude here, he's obviously watching a TV, he's on his laptop, that's the remote representing that. He could also be on his phone. Sometimes when I come home in the evening and I'm watching the news or I'm watching something on TV, because I still watch TV, but I'm also on my phone. I'm scrolling through Twitter or Instagram. I'm also, sometimes I have my laptop open because maybe I was doing a piece of work that I was too lazy to finish at work. So I have multiple screens, and yeah, there's screams as well, actually, because it's in my head. The scream, this deluge of information is causing my brain to scream a little. And I know I put this down as That's because it's called multimodal media. And I want you to remember this and what it does to your brain. The scream that I was talking about, this is what happens. You're constantly bombarded, deluged with information. And the problem is that when you're deluged with information of this sort, you're going to be making a really quick decision. I talked about how journalists have to make quick decisions because they're running out of time. We tend to make quick decisions because we are bombarded with too much information. Our brain is in overload, and we have to choose something to believe. When there's too much information, what we believe is what we feel is right. It may not be the truth. It may be coming from somebody that we like. It's all those biases that our brain or reactive part of our brain actually sort of kicks in when we're bombarded with this much information, when we're on multiple screens, and when we are constantly on social media. And this happens to journalists too, because you know what? I know I said I'm a white rabbit, I feel like a white rabbit, but I'm also human. So in essence, when you read the news, when you see the news, when you read the news, it's coming through this friction process, as flawed as it can be. There is still a degree of guardrails, of gatekeeping at play. So even if you watch Geo or AOI, you know what their biases are. It's gone through some kind of process. Because you recognize that bias, and recognizing those biases is really, really important, you kind of understand that this could be more true, this would not be true. Your reality or sense of reality is not shaped by your bias because you've recognized it, and the channel's bias because you recognized it. Social media, this is what it does. It's all unfiltered. It's all unfiltered. You're being bombarded with it. You choose to believe what you like, what you feel is true, rather than the actual truth. And I know I have a few minutes left, so I'm going to sort of conclude this. And again, I think Dr. Zafar Mirza will appreciate the vaccine picture very much. Essentially, and this is my call to action, this is something that I've been doing for a few years now. As a journalist, I was obviously a producer of information. And then I became director at the Center for Excellence in Journalism at the Ivey University. And I did a series of trainings with university students, just like all of you. And I was trying to teach media and digital literacy and critical thinking. And critical thinking, and we could also call it debiasing. And there are obviously curricula and training programs on this that even journalists need to subject themselves to, because this is something that I've been saying for a few years now. Increasingly, journalists have much more of a responsibility because people's primary source of information comes from social media. So they need to be more credible. And they don't take that responsibility as seriously as they should. They need to put aside their own personal biases aside. They need to take a stand within newsrooms if the biases of the particular channels or newsrooms that they're working at force their viewpoint on them. Because journalism is becoming irrelevant, to be honest. And that's why it is important for journalists to undergo this kind of training as well, this debiasing. What are some of the tricks or tips? I'm going to refer to, I think, one of the ones that I find the easiest, and just talking through the process of what journalists do and then how they can unbias themselves, and what you can do and how you can unbias yourself. I have about a minute left, so I'll try to be brief. Journalists the newsrooms need to be diverse. So there's a diversity of opinion. You have to talk to multiple people. You have to, that second check where there's another person who looks at your work is really important, because they're coming from a different point of view and will catch you on your biases. That is how you contain the bias at the journalistic level. But at the human level, it really is as simple as asking yourself the question, what if the thing that I'm hearing comes from a person that I like? And what if it comes from a person I didn't like? It's that mental reframing that you need to do in order to unbias yourself or debias yourself. And that's just the beginning. So 7, 8 years old, and I spoke to a neurologist who's working on debiasing. And children's brains are really elastic. There's no stereotypes that are shaped by the family that you're born into, the society that you grow up in, the media that you consume. You know, they will see people as they are. And you can actually retrain yourself, that elastic brain, to debias yourself. If you employ a few simple tricks, if there's more critical thinking taught at universities, starting maybe even from the school level. Thank you very much.